Providence Municipal Court had seen decades of routine speeding tickets and everyday cases, but on Tuesday morning, December 12th, something extraordinary happened. A man walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom wearing a fitted suit, polished shoes, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced. His posture, his awareness, the way he instinctively positioned himself with a clear view of every exit, it was the kind of presence you don't forget. Judge Caprio recognized it immediately. This wasn't just a former federal agent. This was someone who had once stood only feet away from the President of the United States, a man trained to detect danger before anyone else even sensed it. But what the judge didn't know yet was that this same man had been fighting a different kind of threat, a personal tragedy so heavy, so devastating, that even the strongest protector couldn't outrun it. And what he revealed inside that courtroom would become one of the most emotional moments in Judge Caprio's 4 decades on the bench. Before we go any deeper, subscribe to Case Closed right now. We're closing in on 3,000 subscribers, and nearly all of you watching still haven't joined the family. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories about sacrifice, service, and the hidden battles behind the strongest faces, hit that button. Welcome to Case Closed, where real stories remind us that justice isn't only about laws, it's about humanity. As you watch this, comment below and tell us, what's the greatest sacrifice you would make for someone you love? Because the decision this former Secret Service agent made, a decision that changed the course of his entire life, will not only break your heart, it will rebuild your belief in what people are willing to do for their families. And before we reveal what Judge Caprio uncovered, I want you to think about something. When you see someone who carries themselves with absolute confidence, someone whose presence commands a room, do you ever stop and wonder what battles they've survived that the world never sees? Hold on to that thought, because this story will forever change the way you look at silent strength. Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court had settled into its familiar rhythm. Judge Frank Caprio, now 80 years old, had presided over countless traffic violations, parking disputes, and minor infractions. The gallery was filled with the usual mix of nervous drivers, frustrated commuters, and people hoping the judge's famous compassion would extend to their particular circumstances. At 9:32 a.m., when David Thompson walked through the courtroom doors, the energy in the room shifted imperceptibly. He was a man in his early 50s, standing exactly 6 feet tall, with graying temples, and the kind of posture that spoke of decades of military and federal training. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes mirror-polished, and he moved with the fluid awareness of someone who had spent years scanning crowds for threats. But it wasn't his professional appearance that caught Judge Caprio's attention. It was something more subtle. The way David's eyes swept the courtroom entrances and exits, the careful positioning he chose in the gallery that gave him clear sightlines to all access points, the unconscious way he kept his hands free and ready. These were the habits of someone trained in executive protection. The other defendants noticed him too, though they couldn't quite articulate what made him different. "Looks like FBI," someone whispered. "Probably a cop," another voice suggested. But David Thompson sat quiet dignity, his hands folded, his attention respectfully focused on the proceedings, betraying none of the anxiety that seemed to affect everyone else waiting for their cases to be called. Court reporter Margaret Walsh, who had been documenting Judge Caprio's cases for 18 years, made a note about the unusually composed defendant. In her experience, people facing serious charges usually showed some sign of stress,
fidgeting, whispering to companions, checking phones nervously. David Thompson showed none of these behaviors. He sat with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to long hours of silent vigilance. When Bailiff Officer Martinez called the case at 10:15 a.m., the State of Rhode Island versus David Michael Thompson, case number 2024 MV 9847, excessive speed in a school zone. David stood with military precision. His movement was so controlled and professional that it immediately caught Judge Caprio's trained eye. "Please state your name for the record," Judge Caprio said, beginning the routine that had become second nature over 4 decades of judicial service. "David Michael Thompson, Your Honor," he replied. His voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to speaking clearly under pressure, with just a trace of a Chicago accent that suggested Midwestern roots. "Mr. Thompson, according to the citation, you were traveling 45 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour school zone on November 28th at approximately 2:47 p.m. How do you plead to this charge?" "Guilty, Your Honor," David said without hesitation. "I was speeding, and I take full responsibility for my actions." The straightforward admission surprised some gallery members who had expected someone with David's obvious professional background to challenge the citation or request legal representation. But Judge Caprio recognized the response of someone who accepted accountability without excuses. "Mr. Thompson, can you explain the circumstances that led to this violation?"
David hesitated for the first time, and Judge Caprio saw something flicker across his composed expression. Not defiance or irritation, but something that looked like controlled desperation. "Your Honor, I was rushing to reach my son at his school. I had received a call from the principal indicating that there was an urgent situation requiring my immediate presence." Now we're getting to the heart of the story, and if you're finding this as compelling as I am, hit that like button right now, because it helps us share these incredible moments with more people. But here's what I want to know. Comment below, have you ever broken the law to help your child? Because David's reason for speeding is about to reveal something that will shock Judge Caprio and everyone in that courtroom. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly. Emergency situations involving children often provided context that significantly changed how he approached traffic violations. But something in David's tone suggested there was much more to this story than a simple school emergency. "Mr. Thompson, what kind of urgent situation required you to speed to a school zone?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Judge Caprio caught the subtle sign of controlled emotion. For someone with David's obvious professional training, any visible reaction suggested the situation was extremely serious. "Your Honor, my son has been struggling with severe depression and anxiety. The principal called to inform me that he had written what appeared to be a suicide note and that they were concerned for his immediate safety." The courtroom fell completely silent. This wasn't a routine traffic violation case. This was a father racing to prevent his child's suicide. David Thompson looked directly at Judge Caprio, and in that moment of eye contact, something profound shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. Saw not just the controlled professionalism of a federal agent, but the raw pain of a father who had witnessed his child struggle with mental illness. "Your Honor," David said with quiet dignity, "I served on the presidential security detail for President Barack Obama for 6 years, from 2009 to 2005. The revelation hit the courtroom like lightning. Barack Obama, still one of the most beloved and respected figures in American politics, had been protected by the man now standing before Judge Caprio for a traffic violation. Every person in the gallery immediately understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Judge Caprio's eyes widened with recognition and something approaching awe. This wasn't just any defendant. This was someone who had literally put his life on the line every day for 6 years to protect the President of the United States. Okay, I need everyone watching to pause and think about this. Comment below, did you see this twist coming? Because what David reveals next about his time protecting President Obama is going to completely reframe this entire story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you possibly waiting for? Hit that subscribe button because Judge Stories is documenting the most incredible courtroom moments in American history. Mr. Thompson, Judge Caprio said, his voice taking on a tone of deep respect, when you say you served on President Obama's security detail, what exactly was your role? I was part of the counter-assault team for 6 years, Your Honor. I was responsible for neutralizing threats against the president during public appearances, travel security, and residential protection at the White House and other secure locations. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations. People were pulling out their phones, undoubtedly searching for images from Obama's presidency, wondering if they could spot David Thompson
in the background of official photos. Judge Caprio himself was processing the enormity of having someone with this level of service record in his courtroom. Mr. Thompson, are you currently employed with the Secret Service? No, Your Honor. I retired from federal service in 2015. And why did you leave the Secret Service, if you don't mind me asking? David was quiet for a long moment, and Judge Caprio could see him wrestling with how much personal information to share in a public courtroom. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had changed everything. Your Honor, my son was diagnosed with severe clinical depression and anxiety disorder when he was 12. The demands of my position with the Secret Service, the travel, the long hours, the security restrictions that prevented me from discussing my work made it increasingly difficult for me to be the father he needed. Judge Caprio felt a chill of recognition. David Thompson had walked away from one of the most prestigious positions in federal law enforcement to care for his mentally ill child. Thoughtful, Mr. Thompson. That must have been an incredibly difficult decision. Yes, Your Honor, but my son was more important than my career. I could protect the President of the United States, but I couldn't protect my own child from his depression. I realized that the only way to help him was to be present in his life consistently. Judge Caprio was beginning to understand the full scope of David Thompson's sacrifice. Secret Service agents who served on presidential details typically had lucrative post-government career opportunities in private security or corporate protection. Walking away from that world to care for a depressed child represented a level of parental dedication that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. And how has your son been since you left the service? David's controlled expression finally cracked slightly, and Judge Caprio saw the raw emotion that this man had been carrying for years. It's been a struggle, Your Honor. Some years are better than others. He's had multiple hospitalizations, several medication adjustments, and ongoing therapy. The transition from being the Secret Service agent's son to having a father who was fully present helped for a while, but depression is a relentless enemy. Here's where this story becomes absolutely heartbreaking. And I need you to comment below. Do you know someone who struggles with depression? Because what David tells Judge Caprio next about his son's recent crisis will make you understand why this traffic violation case is really about a father's desperate love. Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that you were speeding to reach your son because of a suicide note. Can you tell me more about what happened that day? David took a deep breath, and Judge Caprio could see him making the decision to share one of the most painful moments of his life with a room full of strangers. Your Honor, my son had seemed to be doing better recently. He was attending school regularly, participating in some activities, and had even talked about college applications. But depression can be deceptive.
On November 28th, his English teacher found a note that my son had written as what appeared to be a goodbye letter. What did the note say? It said that he was tired of being a burden, that he felt like he would never be able to live up to being the son of someone who had served the president. He wrote that everyone expected him to be as strong and disciplined as his father, but that he felt like he couldn't ever.
Weak and broken every day, the courtroom was now completely silent, except for the sound of people quietly crying. Judge Caprio himself felt tears threatening as he processed the devastating irony of David's situation. "Your Honor," David continued, "my son wrote that he knew I had given up my career to take care of him, and that the guilt of that sacrifice was making his depression worse. He said he thought everyone would be better off if he wasn't alive to be a burden anymore." Judge Caprio realized he was witnessing one of the cruelest ironies imaginable. David Thompson had sacrificed his prestigious career to save his son, but that very sacrifice had become part of his son's guilt and self-destructive thoughts. "Mr. Thompson, when you received the call from the school, what went through your mind?" "Terror, Your Honor, absolute terror. I had spent 6 years prepared to take a bullet for President Obama, but nothing in my training prepared me for the possibility that I might lose my son to his own mind. I got in my car and drove as fast as I could because I knew that every minute could be the difference between life and death." Judge Caprio had been sitting silently, listening to David's testimony. The speeding ticket that had brought him to court forgotten in the face of this much larger human drama. "And when you arrived at the school?" "He was alive, Your Honor. The school counselor had been talking with him, and they had convinced him to wait for me to arrive. But seeing him sitting there so small and broken, knowing that my love for him had somehow become part of his pain, it was the hardest moment of my life." Judge Caprio realized that David Thompson represented something profound about service and sacrifice. This man had protected the leader of the free world, but his greatest battle was happening at home, against an enemy that couldn't be neutralized with tactical training or security protocols. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the people who seem strongest are fighting the hardest battles. Because David was about to reveal something that would make Judge Caprio understand that this case was about much more than speeding tickets or even mental illness. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, processing the profound weight of what he was hearing. David Thompson wasn't just another traffic violator. He was a man caught between his identity as someone who had served at the highest levels of government and his role as a father fighting to save his child's life. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Caprio said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm asking not as a judge processing a traffic violation, but as someone who's trying to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. How are you supporting your family since leaving the Secret Service?" The question was more loaded than it appeared. Judge Caprio had recognized that someone with David's background could command significant income in private security, but the demands of caring for a mentally ill child might limit those opportunities. "Your Honor, I currently work as a security consultant for small businesses and private clients. The pay is significantly less than what I earned with the service, but it allows me the flexibility to be available when my son needs me." "And how much less, if you don't mind my asking?" David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing his financial situation in public, but Judge Caprio's genuine concern encouraged him to answer honestly. "About 70% less, Your Honor. I went from earning approximately $95,000 annually with full federal benefits to making roughly $28,000 per year with no health insurance." The courtroom absorbed this information in stunned silence. David Thompson had given up nearly $70,000 in annual income to care for his depressed son.
All right, I need you to stop and really think about this. Comment below. Would you give up $70,000 a year to help your child? Because what David reveals next about the financial cost of his son's mental health treatment will show you exactly how much one father was willing to sacrifice. And if this story is hitting you emotionally, smash that like button, because stories like this are exactly why Judge Stories exists. Mr. Thompson, with that significant reduction in income, how do you manage your son's medical expenses? It's a constant struggle, Your Honor. Mental health treatment is expensive, especially without insurance. My son sees a psychiatrist monthly at $200 per session, a therapist weekly at $120 per session, and his medications cost approximately $400 per month. That's over $1,000 monthly just for his basic mental health care. Judge Caprio did the mathematical calculation quickly. David was spending nearly half his total monthly income on his son's mental health treatment. Thoughtful. Mr. Thompson, that's almost 40% of your gross income just for medical expenses. How do you manage housing, food, and other necessities? We've had to make sacrifices, Your Honor. We moved from our home in Washington, D.C. to a small apartment here in Providence to reduce living costs. I drive a 15-year-old car. We shop at discount stores and use food assistance when necessary. But my son's treatment is non-negotiable. Judge Caprio was beginning to see the full picture of David Thompson's life since leaving the Secret
Service. This man had gone from the pinnacle of federal law enforcement to struggling to make ends meet, all to ensure his son received the mental health care he needed. Mr. Thompson, on the day you were speeding to reach your son at school, were you able to afford the psychiatric crisis intervention he might have needed? David's face darkened with a pain that went beyond words. Sad. No, Your Honor. That's part of what made the situation so desperate. If my son had needed immediate psychiatric hospitalization, I didn't have the money to pay for it. I was racing to the school not just to save his life, but also knowing that I might not be able to afford the professional help he would need. Thoughtful. Did you take him to the hospital? Yes, Your Honor. He was admitted for a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The total cost was $8,400, which I obviously couldn't pay up front. The hospital agreed to a payment plan that requires me to pay $350 per month for the next 2 years. Judge Caprio realized that David Thompson was now paying over $1,350 per month for his son's mental health care, more than half his total income.
What absolutely breaks my heart about this story, and I want you to comment below, do you think our healthcare system is failing families like David's? Because what he tells Judge Caprio next about the impossible choices he faces will make you understand why this speeding ticket represents so much more than a traffic violation.
Mr. Thompson, with these financial obligations, how do you manage day-to-day expenses? We don't manage well, Your Honor. There are months when I have to choose between my son's therapy sessions and groceries. There are weeks when I work double shifts doing security for local events just to keep up with his medication costs. And there are days when I wonder if he would have been better off if I had stayed with the Secret Service and earned enough money to pay for the best mental health care available. Judge Caprio felt his heart breaking for this man who was second-guessing the most selfless decision of his life. Mr. Thompson, do you regret leaving the Secret Service? David was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried both conviction and pain. No, Your Honor. My son needed me present more than he needed me wealthy. But I do regret that we live in a society where a father has to choose between being present for his child and being able to afford his child's medical care. Judge Caprio realized he was looking at a systemic failure that went far beyond individual circumstances. David Thompson represented countless families trapped between the need to provide care and the financial inability to afford that care. Mr. Thompson, on the day you received the speeding ticket, after dealing with your son's crisis, What was your mental state when you realized you had been
cited for a traffic violation? David's controlled expression cracked completely for the first time. Honestly, Your Honor, it felt like the final blow. I had just spent 3 days in the hospital with my son, wondering how I was going to pay for his care. And then I realized I was facing a fine that I literally could not afford to pay. The ticket was $195, and I knew that money would have to come from somewhere else in our already impossible budget. Judge Caprio understood now that this wasn't really about a speeding ticket. This was about a broken system that penalized people for trying to save their children's lives and then penalized them again for the economic consequences of that desperation. And what happened next would prove that sometimes justice requires more than following the letter of the law. Because Judge Caprio was about to do something that would change David Thompson's life and restore his faith that there were still people who understood the difference between legal technicalities and human necessity. Judge Caprio stood up slowly, abandoning his judicial bench to address David Thompson directly. The action sent a ripple of surprise to the courtroom. In 40 years of municipal court proceedings, Judge Caprio rarely left his position of formal authority to speak to defendants at their level. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying the moral weight that had made him famous. "In 4 decades on this bench, I have never encountered a case that so perfectly illustrates both the best of human nature and the worst of our systemic failures." The judge walked around his bench, approaching David at the defendant's podium. Every person in the courtroom held their breath as Judge Caprio prepared to address not just a traffic violation, but a
Profound moral crisis. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Mr. Thompson. I see a man who spent 6 years ready to die for his country. I see a father who gave up financial security, professional prestige, and career advancement to be present for his mentally ill child. And I see someone who is being punished by a system that should be supporting him. David's composed facade finally began to crack, and Judge Caprio could see the emotional toll that years of impossible choices and financial stress had taken on this dedicated father. Before I tell you what Judge Caprio does next, I need everyone watching to comment below right now. When was the last time you saw someone in authority stand up for what's truly right instead of just what's technically legal? Because what happens next will give you chills and restore your faith in justice. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that what you did, choosing your son's well-being over your career advancement, represents everything that's right about fatherhood. In a world where too many parents prioritize their professional success over their children's needs, you chose differently. You chose sacrifice over status, presence over prestige. Judge Caprio's voice was rising with moral conviction, carrying the passion that had made his courtroom famous for moments of profound humanity. But more than that, I want everyone in this courtroom to understand what we're really looking at here. We're looking at a father who has given everything he has to keep his son alive and is being penalized for the desperation that led him to speed while racing to prevent a suicide. The judge turned toward the gallery, addressing not just David but everyone present. Mr. Thompson, you were speeding through a school zone because you were trying to reach your child before he took his own life. You weren't racing to make money or avoid responsibility or satisfy your own convenience. You were racing to save the life of the person you love most in the world. Judge Caprio walked back toward his bench, but instead of climbing the steps, he stopped and faced David directly. Mr. Thompson, regarding the speeding violation that brought you to my courtroom today, all charges are dismissed. All fines are waived. All penalties are removed from your record. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. But more than that, he continued, raising his hand for silence, I want to address the larger injustice that this case represents. Judge Caprio's expression became more serious, and his voice took on the authority of someone who had spent decades witnessing the intersection of law and human need. Mr. Thompson, you have spent years protecting our nation's highest office, and now you're struggling to afford basic mental health care for your son. That represents a moral failure of our society that goes far beyond traffic violations. The judge paused, choosing his words with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of his platform. I'm going to do something that I rarely do in traffic court. I'm going to write a letter to our state's Mental Health Services Department detailing your situation and requesting emergency assistance for your family's mental health care costs. David Thompson's eyes filled with tears for the first time since entering the courtroom. After years of fighting alone, someone with real authority was finally recognizing the impossible situation his family faced. Here's the moment that's going to absolutely break your heart. Furthermore, Judge Caprio announced, I am personally going
to contact local mental health organizations to see if we can establish a fund to help families like yours. Families where parents have sacrificed their careers to care for mentally ill children. Judge Caprio's voice carried now the full weight of his moral authority. Mr. Thompson, I want you to understand something. Your decision to leave the Secret Service to care for your son makes you a hero, not a failure. Your willingness to sacrifice your income to be present for his mental health crisis makes you exactly the kind of father every child deserves. The judge spoke directly to David, but ensured his words carried to everyone in the courtroom. Your son is struggling with depression, but he has something that many depressed young people don't have. A father who has proven through action, not just words, that his child's life is more important than anything else in the world. Judge Caprio turned back toward the gallery one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a society that claims to value family and mental health, but then creates systems that force parents to choose between being present for their children and being able to afford their children's medical care. David Thompson shouldn't have to make that choice, and his speeding ticket shouldn't exist because his desperate race to save his son's life shouldn't have been necessary. The applause began again, but this time it was sustained and emotional. People were standing not just to show respect for Judge Caprio's words, but to acknowledge David Thompson's sacrifice and the systemic injustice he represented. And what Judge Caprio did next would ensure that David Thompson's story became a catalyst for real change in how society supports families dealing with mental health crisis. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, but
Before sitting down, he made one final statement that would be remembered by everyone present and shared across social media platforms as an example of justice that transcends legal technicalities. Mr. Thompson, I want to make you a promise. Your story doesn't end with this dismissed ticket. I'm going to make sure that people understand what real sacrifice looks like. I'm going to make sure that your son knows his father is a hero. And I'm going to make sure that other families facing similar struggles know they're not alone. David Thompson finally broke down completely. Months of held-back emotion pouring out in tears that represented years of struggle, sacrifice, and love. The man who had faced down potential presidential assassins was overcome by the simple recognition that someone understood his impossible situation. If you're not emotional right now, you need to check your pulse, because this is exactly why Judge Stories exists. This is why we document these incredible moments of human courage and judicial compassion. And if this story has moved you, you absolutely must subscribe to our channel right now, because we're documenting the most important courtroom moments that prove justice and humanity can still coexist. Judge Caprio's voice softened as he addressed David personally. Mr. Thompson, when your son asks you someday why you gave up your prestigious career to take care of him, you can tell him this. You chose to be the kind of father who shows up when his child needs him.
You chose to be the kind of man who values presence over prestige. And you chose to demonstrate through action that your love for him is stronger than any professional ambition. Judge's words carried beyond the immediate legal proceedings, speaking to larger questions about parental responsibility and societal support.
Your service to President Obama was honorable and important, but your service to your son is heroic and irreplaceable. Anyone can learn protective tactics and security protocols, but not everyone can learn the kind of selfless love that makes a father give up everything for his child's well-being. Judge Caprio looked toward the gallery one final time. I want everyone here to remember David Thompson's story. I want you to remember that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes heroes wear business suits and work multiple part-time jobs to pay for their children's therapy. Sometimes heroes give up $70,000 salaries to be present when their children need them most. As David prepared to leave the courtroom, several people approached him with offers of help and support. A local psychiatrist pressed her card into his hand, offering to provide sessions at a reduced rate. A woman from the gallery identified herself as a social worker and offered to help navigate mental health assistance programs. But here's the most incredible outcome of this story, and I want you to comment below about this. Within 2 weeks of this courtroom appearance, Judge Caprio's letter to the state mental health department resulted in David's family being approved for emergency mental health assistance that covered 80% of his son's treatment costs. A local news station picked up the story and community donations poured in to help with the remaining expenses. A mental health advocacy organization offered David a position as a family liaison specialist, work that paid enough to support his family while allowing him to help other parents navigating similar crises. Most importantly, David's son began to improve significantly. Knowing that his father's sacrifice had been recognized and supported by the community helped alleviate much of the guilt that had
been fueling his depression. He later wrote a letter to Judge Caprio saying, "You didn't just dismiss my dad's ticket. You helped save my life by showing me that his love for me was something to be proud of, not guilty about." David Thompson returned to court 6 months later, not as a defendant, but to update Judge Caprio on his son's progress and to thank him for catalyzing the support that had transformed their lives. Here's what I want you to take away from this incredible story. David Thompson proved that true heroism isn't always about dramatic action. Sometimes it's about quiet, consistent sacrifice. He showed us that the people who serve our country at the highest levels are also parents struggling with the same challenges we all face. And he demonstrated that the most important protection we can provide isn't for presidents or celebrities, but for our own children. If this story inspired you, if it made you think differently about sacrifice and mental health support, then you need to do 3 things right now. First, smash that subscribe button because Case Closed is documenting the moments that prove our legal system can still show compassion. Second, share this video with someone who needs to understand that seeking help for mental health is a sign of strength, not weakness. And third, comment below and tell us, do you think our society does enough to support families dealing with mental health crisis? As David prepared to leave the courtroom, several people approached him with offers of help and support. A local psychiatrist pressed her card into his hand, offering to provide sessions at a reduced rate. A woman from the gallery identified herself as a social worker and offered to help navigate mental health assistance programs.
But here's the part of this story that still brings people to tears. And I want you to tell me in the comments what you think about this. Just 2 weeks after that courtroom moment, Judge Frank Caprio's letter to the state mental health department changed everything for David's family. Because of that letter, the department approved emergency mental health assistance that covered 80% of his son's treatment, something the family had been fighting for months to secure. Then, the story reached a local news station and something incredible happened. People across the community began donating, helping cover the remaining medical expenses.
A national mental health advocacy organization heard what David had gone through and offered him a job as a family liaison specialist, work that finally allowed him to support his household while helping other parents surviving the same nightmare. And the most important miracle? David's son began to heal. For the first time in months, the young man felt hope, because he finally understood that his father hadn't struggled because of him, but for him. He later wrote a letter to Judge Caprio that said, "You didn't just forgive my dad's ticket, you helped save my life. You showed me that what he did wasn't a burden, it was love." 6 months later, David Thompson walked back into that courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a father, ready to share his son's progress and to personally thank the judge whose compassion ignited a chain of support that changed their lives forever. Here's what I want you to take from this. David Thompson showed the world that real heroism doesn't always look like running toward danger or guarding a president. Sometimes it looks like a father quietly sacrificing every piece of himself to keep his child
alive. And Judge Frank Caprio showed us, once again, why his legacy will live long after he leaves the bench. Because he understood something our system often forgets. Justice isn't just about the law. It's about humanity. It's about seeing people. It's about reaching out at the exact moment it matters most. If this story moved you, if it gave you hope, or made you think differently about mental health, sacrifice, and the unseen battles people face, then do 3 things. Subscribe to Case Closed, because this channel is keeping the legacy of Judge Caprio alive through stories that prove compassion still has a place in justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that asking for help is strength, not weakness. Comment below. Do we as a society do enough to support families fighting mental health battles behind closed doors? This is Case Closed, where the stories Judge Caprio inspired remind us that justice can still change lives.